All right, welcome back. Today we'll be talking about Chapter 12 from AMSCO AP European History, which is generally on the social effects of 1648 to 1815. These types of lectures looking at social effects is always really good to do at the end of the unit because social effects are happening in the background of all of the other historical developments. So it acts as a really good review. So kind of with that in mind, before we even get to the content of the lecture, reviewing what happened from 1648 to 1815. And so just kind of mapping this out almost as like a mini timeline. 1648, that is the Peace of Westphalia. Peace of Westphalia ends the 30 Years' War. It ends the religious wars. And so 1648 is one of those key turning points in European history because it marks an end of 150 years of religious conflict, and it begins to lead to a period of more religious toleration and eventually some social intellectual movements like the Enlightenment. When we look at this time period as well, okay, so 1648, that was the Peace of Westphalia, end of the 30 Years' War. Right around the year 1700 or so, 1700-ish, we see the development of absolutism. So think of King Louis XIV in France, Peter the Great in Russia. But we also see the development of constitutionalism. Think about the Glorious Revolution in England, 1689. So as one conflict ends, the religious wars, a new conflict begins of these two political ideologies, absolutism and constitutionalism, developing kind of in parallel with each other. Absolutism in France, Russia, Prussia, constitutionalism mostly in England and the Netherlands. We're talking about 1750 or kind of mid-1700s. We have the development of the Enlightenment. And then obviously before that was the Scientific Revolution. So I'll just add kind of in parentheses, we have the Scientific Revolution. But you might remember while the Enlightenment took place, in a set place, Paris, France, and at a set time, 1730 to 1770, the Scientific Revolution, on the other hand, was a very gradual process. Copernicus wrote his ideas right around 1500. Galileo was in the 1600s. Isaac Newton was in the 1700s. So the Scientific Revolution is happening in the background of all of this, 1500s to 1700s, let's say. And then the kind of last big event that we need to remember from this time period is the French Revolution and then Napoleon Bonaparte, which takes us up to 1815. So these are kind of the political developments as well as the intellectual development. So as we look at social effects, it's the social effects while these things are taking place. All right, with all of that in mind, looking first at population growth. One of the biggest trends that we see in European history in the 16 and 1700s is population growth. Specifically, the population doubles in the 1700s. And that's for a variety of reasons, but most of it has to do with healthier foods and new agricultural techniques. Now, if we go back to this timeline, what else is happening in 1648? Well, we've got colonialism. We've got the age of exploration. Now, I know that colonialism started earlier. It started in 1492 with Columbus. Spain was kind of doing a lot of colonizing in the 1500s. England joins the scene in the early 1600s. And so by 1648, 1700, colonialism is in full swing. The European countries all have major overseas colonies. And so one of the biggest things that we see is that the population of Europe doubles. In terms of why that takes place, give me one sec. In terms of why that takes place, well, partially we have access to healthy, nutritious foods from the New World. Again, think about the potato. And this is a result of colonialism, a result of the age of exploration. I'm adding that to really connect the dots to how this is all connected. There's also the agricultural revolution. You might remember the enclosure movement, which was all about combining lots of small farms together into one big farm owned by one kind of wealthy landowner. And this allows them to produce more food more efficiently. And then finally, there's improved transportation, better roads, better canals, which allows them to easily transport foods. Now, when we're talking about improved transportation, you might remember that these were oftentimes funded by monarchs. It was a form of mercantilism. Mercantilism, you might remember, is when the government controls all economic decisions to benefit the state. So King Louis XIV and his finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, they build roads and canals to facilitate domestic trade, and it also allows for more food to be transported. So all of these things are intermingling together. Colonialism in the age of exploration is bringing new foods to Europe. The development of absolutism is allowing these foods to be transported throughout a country, and all of that leads to huge population growth. Now, with population growth comes prosperity for some and poverty for others. Because if you think about it, okay, we've got all of this trade coming from the New World. We have roads and canals that are facilitating trade. And we have the enclosure movement that creates these kind of massive farms owned by one landowner. And so you can probably guess this is going to lead to a lot of wealth for merchants and the kind of larger landowners. And so for them, at least, it leads to a consumer revolution. Basically, they have more wealth. They're spending that money on luxury goods. And so we have the book trade beginning to become a thing beyond just the super wealthy. We have private homes, sometimes in the city, but oftentimes on the outskirts of the city where they would have more space. You see new leisure venues like coffee houses where middle-class folk could go and relax, taverns for the working class, theaters for the upper class. And so all of these new leisure activities are a result of the fact that there's more trade, there's more wealth, there's more prosperity for many. Now, as we've talked about before, there's prosperity for some, upper class and middle class for sure, but poverty for others. Peasants suffer the most. You might remember when we talked about enclosure, they lost their land. They oftentimes were forced to move to the city. And so it led to a lot of poverty for them. And it also says here that communal values eroded. By communal values, what I mean is like, before the enclosure movement, everybody would have their own farm, and Sunday would be a day of rest and a day of prayer, where the community would come together at the church. There would be community festivals where all the different farms would meet up and have some form of festival or celebration. But as the enclosure movement forces a lot of peasants off of their land, those communal traditions begin to fade away. Now, there are new communal traditions, these leisure activities, going to coffee houses, going to taverns, but traditions begin to change. So community traditions begin to change, for better or for worse. That's up to you to decide. In addition to all of the population growth, there's also massive religious changes. Now, remember, okay, we're starting this lecture in 1648. Think backwards a little bit. The last 150 years in Europe, from 1500 to 1650, had been characterized by religious turmoil and religious conflict. I'll just do a super quick recap here. So we talk about 1500 to 1650 was characterized by religious turmoil and change. You've got Martin Luther in 1517, starting off the Protestant Reformation. You've got in kind of 1550-ish, you've got the Catholic Reformation, where they ban books, index of prohibited books. They create the Jesuits to spread the word of God. And then 1550 to 1650, we have 100 years of religious wars. The German Wars of Religion, the French Wars of Religion, the Revolt of the Netherlands, and the 30 Years War. And so when we start looking at 1648, Europeans have been living through religious conflict and religious turmoil for 150 years. Nobody alive knew of a time when Catholicism was the only, or was the dominant religion. By the time we pick it up in 1650, Europe is still largely Catholic. France is still mostly Catholic. Italy is still mostly Catholic, although there is more religious toleration. Remember, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 granted religious toleration to Lutherans and Calvinists. In England, after the Glorious Revolution, 1689, the Act of Toleration also granted religious toleration. So that's one of the big trends that we see, is there is increased religious toleration. This is especially after the Peace of Augsburg, or the Edict of Nantes, or the Peace of Westphalia, which ended all of those religious wars. And then this has also kind of will later influence Voltaire's ideas. I'm trying to connect this lecture to as many topics as I can. So, okay, there's increased religious toleration, but people are still deeply religious. But religion begins to manifest itself in different ways. You might remember, before the Protestant Reformation, people would blindly accept religious sources of authority. They would blindly accept whatever the Catholic Church said, or whatever the priest or pope said. Now, because of the Reformation, people begin to question traditional sources of authority. And the biggest thing, the biggest way that we see that is with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. So people begin to question religious authority. Now, they're not questioning religion. They're not questioning God, but they are questioning perhaps the church, capital C, Catholic Church, or perhaps they're questioning what the Pope said. And what these scientists are saying instead, let me put this in here real quick, scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, what they're saying instead is they're saying, well, we should not blindly accept what the church says. Instead, we should do investigative work. We should engage in the scientific method and rational thinking. We should study the world around us, do experiments, collect observations and data, and make observations based off of that. The Catholic Church was often threatened by these scientists. Remember, Copernicus said the Earth is no longer at the center of the universe. Galileo proved that. But these scientists were actually deeply inspired by religion. Copernicus was actually a priest as well as an astronomer. Galileo was a devout Catholic. And so many of these scientists and philosophers or philosophers were inspired by religion. And their goal was to better understand God by studying the world, nature, science. Now, that leads to conflict with the Catholic Church. Galileo was placed under house arrest, for example. Copernicus's books were banned, among others. But scientists thought they were actually doing God's work, if you will. In addition to them questioning religious authority, there is a new religious theory called deism. This was kind of the religion of the Enlightenment. And this was, as I talked about in a previous lecture, this is the idea of God as a clockmaker. The idea that God created the universe. He created the universe perfect. Perfect mathematical laws. It will run to perfection for eternity. But just like a clockmaker is not always tinkering with the clock, God closed the clock, walked away, and left. The idea of deism, the idea of God as a clockmaker, it proved, according to them, it proved God's existence. God is perfect. God created the universe. But it also says that God is not present in our daily lives. And so when we pray to God, God isn't necessarily listening, or he's not going to intervene. That was, you might think it was a depressing idea, but to people back then, it was actually incredibly empowering, because it said, number one, God is perfect. God created the world. And number two, God gave us the gift of reason and the gift of free will and the power to change the world around us. So It's actually a very empowering idea at the time. So again, when we talk about religious changes, there is this conflict of kind of religion versus reason, I guess, or religion versus science. Scientists didn't think they had to contradict, but it led to quite a few conflicts. Okay. One of the other big intellectual or social changes that we're seeing is the increase in education. John Locke is probably the most important figure here. John Locke was technically not part of the Enlightenment. He was writing in the late 1600s, so 50 years before, but historians typically lump him into the Enlightenment. John Locke, in addition to saying that everybody's born with natural rights, the government must protect our natural rights, John Locke also said that everyone is born as a tabula rasa. Everyone is born as a blank slate. We are born pure, naturally good, but we're also born without any preconceived ideas or notions about how the world works. And it's society and culture and education that shapes us to be who we are today. And so if someone is evil, it's not because they were born evil. It's because they were raised in a household that fostered evil ideas. And so John Locke, through this idea of tabula rasa, says if we have, an education based in morals, then we can raise people to be more moral. And so what do we see here? We see literacy rates increasing. The number of people who can read is increasing. That's going to lead to a huge book trade. The Bible was the most popular book, especially after it was translated into the vernacular by Martin Luther and others. But we also see a huge book trade in the 1700s. So during the Enlightenment, we see newspapers being published in cities. We also see novels, especially novels for women. And so there's a whole new literary genre, I suppose, targeted towards middle and upper class women, allowing them to read, I guess we would call them romance novels today. And then we also see the first state-run school systems. Prussia creates one. You might remember the Fredericks. They create a state-run education system. And then Napoleon Bonaparte as well creates a state-run high school when he becomes emperor. Now, Napoleon had some ulterior motives here. His motive was actually to kind of inspire French patriotism and inspire French unity. And he does that through a state-run school system. And so these state-run school systems, I'm going to say that this is maybe an example of enlightened absolutism. Because you have absolute monarchs like Napoleon Bonaparte who are using their absolute power to spread enlightened ideas through education and through schooling. It's a good example of enlightened absolutism. The last social change, I guess, is the change in role of women. In the first period of this class, 1450 to 1648, women had their traditional gender roles. And the Reformation began to change those. So let me plug some ideas in here. Reformation offers some new roles for women as nuns, as essentially religious, not as religious leaders, but they could engage in religious conversations. But even during the Reformation, women were still seen as inferior and subservient, and were supposed to obey the man. By the time we get to the Enlightenment in the mid-1700s, this debate is still ongoing as to the role of women. Mary Wollstonecraft is the most famous female philosopher of her time who argued that women deserve equal rights and an equal vote. And she called on men to generously snap our chains and to free women. On the opposite side of that was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, famous for his Social Contract and Democracy, who said that women are inferior and they should obey men, obey the male of the household. And so during the Enlightenment, there was a debate around whether women were deserving of the rights of man that men got in the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, for example. Now, despite that debate, there was one key step forward for women, which is that wealthy women would host salons. These were they were almost like book club meetings, where people would come and discuss the ideas of the Enlightenment. And so, again, oftentimes when we talk about the change in role of women, it's oftentimes only wealthier women who are making these steps forward, but it is still a step forward. Women are seen as perhaps not intellectually equal just yet, but at least intellectually worthy enough to have a conversation with men about academic topics, which is, I suppose, a step forward. So it says there, the Enlightenment granted women new rights, like being able to host salons, getting an education, increased literacy rates for women. For a short time, at least, women were able to own property, and women were able to divorce an abusive husband, for example. But Napoleon takes those rights away from women, and he really reintroduces a patriarchy or a male-dominated system. So women cannot divorce. Women cannot own property. Women cannot go to court and sue without the male's permission. And so, like a lot of times in history with the change in role of women, it is, I don't know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or maybe it's even 1 step forward, 1 step back, and they end up right where they started. So recapping this, we talked about some of the key events of the last few chapters from 1648 to 1815. The religious wars are over, so there is increased religious toleration. There's new forms of government developing, absolutism, constitutionalism, and then the Enlightenment and the effects the Enlightenment has with the French Rev. When talking about these social effects, kind of 3 or 4 different buckets, we see population growth, which benefits many and harms others. We see religious changes as a result of increased religious toleration, and then also new religious ideas spawned by the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution. Remember to pause here if you need to get these notes. And then finally, really as a result of the Enlightenment, I mean, really all of this, all of these ideas here are a social effects of the Enlightenment. So what are the social effects of the Enlightenment? Well, people begin to question religious authority. There's an increased amount of education and literacy, and people discuss the changing role of women. So again, just to emphasize this, when we're talking about this timeline, 1648 to 1815, it really seems like the Enlightenment, mid-1700s, is that one key event or that one key process where we begin to see both political effects like the French Revolution and social effects as well, questioning religious authority, increased education, and at least a debate over the changing role of women.